So what is a woman? What is a man? Why is this a controversial question? Why are we so confused about something that used to seem so obvious? How did we get here? And more importantly, where do we turn for clarity? So this lecture will explore the genesis of gender in two ways. First, I'm going to tell the more or less linear story of how the concept of gender developed over the last 70 years or so. And then in the second part of the lecture, I'm going to move into a worldview comparison between what I call the gender paradigm and the Christian paradigm or worldview that is presented in Genesis. So let's start with the gender paradigm. First, I want to ask perhaps a really important question. What is gender? What are the possible definitions that we have on the table? Well, you may have noticed there are a lot of them, right? So here's just a random sampling. Okay, so we have the idea of gender as basically a synonym for sex, kind of the polite way of saying sex, but without saying sex, right? Because it has this other meaning. There's the idea of gender as a cultural construct, as a social construct. You may have heard that phrase before. Gender is just a social construct, right? And more recently, we have a concept of gender emerging that it's really about this innate sense of the self, almost like a state of the psyche or the soul. So we have a lot of different definitions on the table here. And depending on who you're talking to, they might be coming from a different perspective. Now, one thing I want to point out here, well, two things. First of all, there's no clear understanding of what the word even means, right? And that's one reason for the confusion, I think, in trying to communicate about what we're even saying. But secondly, I would argue that behind each of these definitions, there's an implicit anthropology or understanding of the human person, as well as an implicit understanding of reality or an implicit ontology. So there are worldview assumptions animating behind the scene, even if we don't always realize it. So let's talk about how this concept of gender and its many forms evolved. So I like to start the story of gender's genealogy with the feminist philosopher Simone de Beauvoir. And that may seem strange considering that de Beauvoir actually didn't use the term gender, right? Her famous book on the topic is called The Second Sex. But she did introduce the concept that gender would soon come to name. And that concept is expressed in her most famous line, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." That statement is really the mustard seed of gender theory. So when she writes that one is not born but becomes a woman, she's making a distinction. She's driving a wedge between the idea of woman and the idea of female, arguing that woman is a social and cultural fabrication that we kind of project or layer onto the biological reality of femaleness. And this distinction that she's making prefigures the turn toward the concept of gender, which would take hold in the 1970s, largely through, initially, the work of psychologist John Money. So John Money was one of the first prominent advocates of a blank slate view of the human person, right? Human beings aren't born, we are made. So he proposed this theory that biological sex has no intrinsic connection to men and women's internalized sense of gender or social roles and behaviors. He drew a distinction between sex as a mere biological fact and what he called gender, a social identity that's a product of culture rather than nature. Now, Money's most famous patient was David Reamer, who was brought to him as a baby after he was disfigured during a botched circumcision. Now, Money, remember, he believed that gender was a social construct, so he simply convinced David's parents to raise him as a girl. Now, David happened to be an identical twin. So Money saw a golden opportunity here to actually run sort of a control experiment to test out his theory of gender. And David's parents, unfortunately, agreed. And he was assigned a female gender and raised as Brenda. As a teenager, David became suicidal, and he rejected or fought against this female identity, and he eventually learned the truth about his sex from his parents. Then, as an adult, he got married, adopted 3 children. For a time, it seemed like he might be able to claim a normal life for himself. But then in 2004, he took his own life at the age of 38, just 2 years after his twin brother died by intentional overdose. So Money's attempts to demonstrate the veracity of his theories failed catastrophically. His theories prove not only to be erroneous, but actually fatal for his two research subjects. But unfortunately, this tragedy took decades to play out. He began seeing the boys in the late 60s, and they didn't die till the early 2000s. Now, in the meantime, this concept of gender as a social construct swept through the academy, becoming thoroughly entrenched in feminist theory and the social sciences in particular. So second wave feminists, that was the movement in the 70s and 80s, they really latched on to this distinction between sex and gender. They saw this as a site of resistance to the idea of essentialism, the idea that men and women are innately different at the level of nature. So instead of relying on just sex to classify men and women, they adopted this term gender. And so a new paradigm was emerging that distinguished between sex as a basic biological fact and gender as this collection of socially constructed norms and ideals that are associated with sex. And this is the classic sex-gender split. If you ever took some feminist theory classes in college or even a sociology class, this is probably the definition that you learned. It was the definition I inherited when I began my feminist studies over 20 years ago. So sex refers to biology, but gender refers to that kind of social narratives about sex. Now, in the late 80s and early 90s, things get even more complicated. This neat distinction between sex and gender in feminist theory begins to unravel, thanks largely to the work of Judith Butler, who is really the godmother of gender theory. So she's a philosopher who teaches at Berkeley. Butler ups the ante of social constructionism. So she asserts that not just gender, but biological sex itself is a social fabrication. So she writes that female no longer appears to be a stable notion. Its meaning is as troubled and unfixed as woman. So Butler leans into many of the ideas asserted by Simone de Beauvoir in The Second Sex, but she takes them to new extremes. Near the end of The Second Sex, Beauvoir proclaims, "Nothing is natural." And for Butler, that statement is a foundational premise for her philosophy. Nothing is natural. This includes the idea that humankind is characterized by two sexes. So she sees that as a social fiction rather than a matter of fact. So this philosophy can be described as anti-realist. So truth is suspended in air quotes as ultimately unknowable or even non-existent. All that remains is power. So knowledge is not a matter of discerning or recognizing what is true, because truth itself is a construction of social power. In other words, whoever's definition is kind of imposed with the most power, that's who determines what is true and what is knowable. So gender theory in the Butler mode rejects the idea that both sex and gender, and any of the terms related, so female, man, woman, gender theory rejects the idea that any of those terms name something real. Instead, those concepts are seen as linguistic power moves that create the illusion of something real. So we're given this category of female, and then we read reality in terms of that, but it's not actually true. So once this distinction between bodily sex and identity was enabled via gender in the mid-20th century, it did not take long, merely a few decades, for gender to shift in meaning once again, becoming entirely disconnected from sex. And this disconnection paved the way for an even more fragmented understanding of the human person to emerge, which I'll call gender identity theory. So it's represented on the timeline here by the gender unicorn, which you may have seen before. It's a common infograph that's used in educational settings. It's also a kind of perfect distillation of what gender identity theory claims. So according to this theory, one's identity as a man or a woman, or both or neither, is based on one's sense of self, one's subjective self-perception. So this theory separates gender, manness and womanness, from biological sex, and roots sexed identity in self-perception rather than the body. So you can see this illustrated by the kind of thought bubble with a rainbow in it. Like that is the ground of whether you're a boy or a girl, a man or a woman, even male or female. So both sex and gender are kind of diverted and grounded now in the self-concept. And in cases where there's a felt incongruity between the thought bubble and the body in terms of sex, this model affirms the thought bubble over the objective fact of biological sex. So that's gender identity theory in a nutshell. Now, some of you savvy ones out there might be picking up on an interesting paradox here. So there's the Butler idea that gender is purely a social construct imposed on us by society, and it's actually oppressive. Now, this is a very different claim than the idea that gender is a real, innate, and immutable identity within oneself that you access, you kind of know it intuitively. Those are two, and it's liberating, it's something good. Those are two contradictory ideas, right? So this slide here kind of illustrates the tensions between those. So gender as a social construct, it's something extrinsic, it's outside of us. It's also artificial and oppressive. It's kind of imposed upon us. And for Butlerian gender theory, the whole point is to kind of mess with gender, just play with gender, queer gender, dismantle categories. Now, with gender identity theory, gender is seen not as a social construct, but as an innate identity. It's intrinsic. It's not artificial. It's authentic. It's more real than sex. And it's liberating. Once you realize this about yourself, that's who you truly are, right? So these are almost directly opposite ideas. Now, if you wanted to strongman this, you could say, okay, well, but we internalize social constructs and they become innate identities. But that's not what gender identity theory claims. Rather, the claim is that gender identity is a truth so profound that you realize it at a very young age, like children know who they are, and your body must be brought into alignment with this inner truth. And in fact, this inner truth might be at odds with your socialization, right? So a boy who's raised as a boy might suddenly realize that he's a girl, and that is the truth of who he is, right? So it's really a fundamentally different idea. Now, what's interesting to me is that gender identity theory is making realist or essentialist claims about gender, right? Whereas gender theory was very anti-realist, anti-essentialist. So gender identity theory makes realist claims like sex is a spectrum. She is a girl trapped in a boy's body, right? So they're making claims about reality. So there's a reification turn that's happening here. So to reify means to make real. So the radical social constructionism of Butler kind of dethroned the reality of sexual difference. It kind of like swept the table clean. So there's nothing there. And this anti-realism created a space for a new realism based not on the objective, intelligible, sensible world, but on one's subjective sense of self. So there's two moves that happen. There's first the deconstruction of anti-realist theory, and then there's a reconstruction or a reification. This new understanding of gender as kind of a disembodied state of the psyche is asserted. So this is really fascinating to me as someone who studied feminism for so long. Gender identity theory actually brings us to a bewildering reversal of that sex-gender split in feminist theory. If you'll remember, in second-wave feminist theory, sex is the fact, it's biology. Gender is the social construct. Well, with gender identity theory, sex is the construct, but gender, the thought bubble, is profoundly real. So that's where we are conceptually. Now I want to transition here from that linear story and move more into a comparative mode, a worldview comparison between the gender paradigm and then gender according to the Christian cosmos. And I'm going to call that the Genesis paradigm. And the word paradigm here really means an interpretive framework, a way of seeing all that is. So you might think of worldview as kind of a similar term. Now, like I mentioned earlier, definitions of gender make claims about anthropology, so claims about the human person, and ontology, so who we are and what is real. And these are not side issues, tertiary issues. These are fundamental, right? These are fundamental worldview questions. So approaching this topic as Christians requires that we hold it up to the light of divine revelation. So we can't answer the question about what gender is from outside of Scripture, but only from within. But why Genesis, right? Out of all of Scripture, why that weird and wonderful book? Well, Genesis is our origin story. And in the ancient world, origin stories are not primarily concerned about material origins. That's more of a modern post-scientific revolution preoccupation. Rather, in the ancient world, origin stories are fundamentally about giving an account of identity and purpose, about who we are and what we're made for. And in the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus is questioned by the Pharisees about marriage and remarriage, he refers back to Genesis, to that original order of creation. And I think this is a very significant move. He doesn't appeal to the law when confronted with questions about how men and women should relate together. He appeals to cosmology, to the sacred narratives of Genesis. And that signals to us that Genesis still gives an account, a true account of who we are, our identity and purpose as human beings. So for Christians, Genesis is our origin story that reveals to us our etiology, where we come from, in order to show us our anthropology, who we are, in order to ultimately point us toward our teleology, what we're made for. So let's get into it. How do these two paradigms compare in their understandings of reality, creation, freedom, the body, language, and sexual difference? Those are the points of comparison I'm going to be making. So this here is a little snapshot from Genesis 1, verses 24 to 31. So I'll just put it up here in case you need a refresher. In Genesis 1, creation unfolds as an integral, interconnected whole, a cosmos. And each stage of this unfolding, each nested layer, is pronounced by God as good. This Genesis cosmology bestows upon human beings specifically an exclusive kind of dignity, a dignity rooted in their role as image bearers. And moreover, Genesis 1 recognizes this natural duality of humankind, male and female. And that difference is part of the goodness of creation. And both sexes share fully in the divine image and the commission to tend the earth. You'll notice that verse 27 here, that's about male and female in the image of God, is offset, right? It's in poetry rather than prose. So this shows us our first big distinction to make between these two paradigms. Who's the creator? In the gender paradigm, it's us, human beings. We construct reality, truth, and meaning. But in Genesis, there is a creator. There's a ground of truth, reality, and meaning, a loving God. And this is a God who makes himself known, a self-disclosing God who desires to be in relationship with his creatures. And that is us. We are creatures. Human beings are creatures, not creators. I mean, we are co-creators with God in a certain sense, but we are not big C creators. We are beings in relation to a God who made us and who in this very instant is holding us in existence. The second distinction I want to make is the concept of reality. In the gender paradigm, because human beings are the creators, reality is something human-made. It's a construct. There might be some level of biological facticity, but any meaning or categorization or interpretation of those facts is a social or linguistic construct. But in the Christian understanding, reality is a gift. There's a givenness to the world. There's a nature to the nature of things. And that givenness is not created by us, but intrinsic to the way things are. These are the distinctive emphases of Genesis. The reality we inhabit is a divinely created order, a harmonious cosmos. And this order is good. It's intentionally called into being by an uncreated creator. And human beings, male and female, are endowed with a unique dignity, marked by the image of their creator, and entrusted with the sacred work of cultivating life. So in the Christian understanding, reality is not something we create, it's something we receive. Now, there are actually two cosmologies in Genesis, or maybe two aspects of one cosmology. Genesis 1 and then Genesis 2 and 3. So the first chapter describes creation from this kind of transcendent vantage point, this God's eye view. And then the second chapter zooms in. We're down in the dust of Eden, and God is depicted in bodily terms, walking and talking with the first humans. So drawing these together, they show us both God's transcendence and also his intimacy. But the Genesis 2 and 3 go into even more detail about the importance of the body and sexual difference in creation. And I just want you, while I have this up, this is from Genesis 2, just notice again that the the text breaks into song at a particular point, because I'm going to refer to that back to that later. So the next kind of distinction to draw is on the body. So that second creation account cuts almost immediately to the creation of the first human being. So God forms the human, in Hebrew the Adam. It's not yet a proper name. It's more like the earthling. Right? So God forms the human from the humus of the soil and breathes into his body and animates him with life. This imagery reveals an important truth about our nature, that we are both earth and breath, matter and spirit. We are physical creatures. Our bodies are integral to who we are, but we're not merely matter, right? Because God's breath, God's spirit enlivens each of us. So this is one of the foundational principles of a Christian anthropology. So every human being is a unity of body and soul, a unity of spirit and matter. What about sexual difference itself? So in Genesis 2, in verse 18, something unexpected happens. God looks at his creation, and for the first time, he says something is not good. It is not good that this first human being is solitary, one of a kind. The human needs a counterpart, a companion. And so begins one of my favorite passages, this parade of animals, right? God gets busy kind of shaping and molding all kinds of creatures and presenting each one to the human to see what he would call them. There's something comical about this imagery. You know, here comes a monkey and a gopher, and the human's like, oh, not quite. You know? But he still gives it a name, right? He discerns its nature, gives it a name, and then this misfit pageant continues. Now, eventually, God goes back to the drawing board. It's not enough just to create more kind of mud beings. So he puts that first human into a deep sleep, and from his side, from one of his ribs, he builds the first woman and presents her before the human. Now, John Paul II reads that sleep as a sleep of non-being. So God almost takes that first human out of existence entirely and brings two new humans into existence, man and woman. So he replaces that non-sex kind of solitary humanity with a humanity that is differentiated into two modes of being human. And now the Adam can properly be called a man. Right? And this is when we see the words male and female first appear in the text, when he issues a cry of wonder upon seeing the woman for the first time, at last. Listen to the delight in those two words. The first words recorded in Scripture spoken by a human being, at last. He immediately recognizes in the silent declaration of her body that she is both like him, more like him than any other creature, but not like him. She resembles him in their shared humanity, right? She's bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh, but differs in the feminine form of her humanity. So Genesis is affirming a balance between sameness and difference between the sexes. And this is a really delicate tension to uphold, but it's really important. So most theories of gender lose this balance. They kind of veer into extremes of uniformity, so men and women are interchangeable, there's really no difference. Or polarity, like men and women are total opposites. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus, right? But both of those extremes lose that fruitful tension that's presented in the Genesis text. Now, I would argue that in both creation narratives, I think they should be almost read as this origin story of sexual difference itself. Because it's not just the creation of human beings that is kind of the apex of each chapter. It's their distinction as male and female, right? Did you notice when both times when the text breaks out into song, it's that moment of proclaiming the maleness and femaleness of human beings. Now, if you know other ancient creation narratives, this is really weird. A lot of other ancient creation stories, one, aren't even that concerned about sexual difference. They don't even mention women. Or they're kind of weirded out by women, like, they're deformed men. We're not quite sure what to do with them, right? But Genesis sees our maleness and our femaleness as this culminating act of God's creation. Oh, I guess I should say the view in the gender paradigm of sexual difference is that it's not real. It's an illusion, right? As opposed to this revelation, right? Language, what about language? So there are two distinct understandings of the relationship between language and truth in these two paradigms. So Genesis depicts a particular relationship between language and reality. So in that first chapter, God uses language to create the cosmos out of nothing, right? He draws order and being out of nothingness. And then in the second chapter, the man uses language to name what God creates. So we might say this in this difference in this way. Divine speech makes reality. Human speech identifies or responds to reality. Now, in the parade of animals, the human's act of naming doesn't just arbitrarily impose meaning, but rather chooses a word that names what objectively exists. So God creates the animal, presents it to the man, and the man recognizes the nature and then bestows a name that proclaims that nature. This dynamic is most obvious in that moment of the naming of woman. The man recognizes that the woman shares his nature, but in a modality that is distinct from his own. And after seeing this truth that's proclaimed by her body, she doesn't say, hey, I'm Eve, I'm a woman. He just can see, like in the visible structure of her body, this truth. And he chooses a word that corresponds to that twofold reality of sameness and difference, isha, woman. This includes the word ish, for male, but adds something new. So these terms, male and female, first appear in the text in this climactic encounter in Genesis 2. So throughout Genesis, naming is depicted as a linguistic response to that which is being named. So reality exists prior to our naming it, and our language is true and meaningful only insofar as it corresponds to what actually exists. Now, most gender theories hold that what we think of as reality is a linguistic and social construction, right? So our use of the terms man and woman create the illusion that those are real things. But this view of language is really an inversion, like a complete reversal of the view depicted in Genesis. In Genesis, meaning intrinsically exists in what God creates, and this meaning is intelligible to us. And we have language that allows us to respond to that reality and try to express it and capture it with a name. The last contrast I want to make is freedom. In the gender paradigm, freedom is pushing past limits, dismantling norms, blurring boundaries. In the postmodern theory of Judith Butler, freedom means subverting any categories that are said to be natural or based in our nature. In other words, freedom is transgression. But in the Genesis paradigm, freedom is belonging. Freedom is found by becoming who we were made to be. So this is an image of the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden from a fresco from 1425, but I feel like it captures the vibe of that story in Genesis. So the original wholeness of Eden disintegrates into conflict and division. So our origin story ends in exile, with Adam and Eve expelled from Eden and left to wander the earth. Well, isn't that a vision of freedom, right? Man no longer corralled in that garden, encumbered by God's rules, liberated to find his own meaning, seek his own destiny. That is what freedom is for our cultural moment. That is what it has become. It's stripped from teleology, from the idea of an ultimate purpose. It's instead reduced to permissiveness, pushing past limits. But in Genesis, the exile from Eden is not triumphant. It's not liberating. It's agonizing. It's weighted down by death. So we're confronted in our time with these two divergent understandings of freedom. On the one hand, freedom according to postmodernity, this open-ended process of self-definition whose only limit is death. And then on the other, freedom as an ever-deepening sense of belonging and wholeness, not only within oneself, but in relation to all that is. To be Christian is to regard oneself in relation to the cosmos and the cosmos in relation to God. And how we relate to each of these things, to ourselves, to creation, to God, subtly influences how we relate to all of them. So I cannot truly honor creation if I don't honor my own body, which is itself a part of creation. And this is something that's been emphasized by Pope Francis. And there's this passage here from one of his letters called Laudato Si, where he says that the acceptance of our bodies as God's gift is vital for welcoming and accepting the entire world as gift. But thinking that we enjoy absolute power over our own bodies turns into thinking that we have absolute power over creation. He says also that valuing one's own body in its masculinity or femininity is necessary if I'm going to be able to recognize myself in an encounter with someone who is different, right? Like Adam does. He says it is not a healthy attitude which would seek to cancel out sexual difference because it no longer knows how to confront it. And I think in that final sentence, he's taking a jab at the gender paradigm. And he rightly sees that a disembodied concept of gender, right, this kind of thought bubble concept of gender, is something that ultimately erases the gift of sexual difference. The body is a gift. Like, that is the Christian view. Embodiment and binds us to all other life, to all of creation. And it's not the idealized body, the airbrushed body, the Instagram body. We find the body's giftedness within its finitude, within its limits and its flaws, because those reveal to us our creatureliness, that we aren't in fact God, right? But we are dependent upon him, and that can awaken us to our ultimate vocation, which is to give and receive love. So amidst all these questions, all this debate and confusion around gender, we have to kind of go back to the beginning and consider what gender is from within the scope of a Christian cosmos. We have to be attentive to the foundation, to the frame, to the assumptions that are being made about reality and about anthropology. So a Christian approach to gender is one that seeks to move from that wilderness of sin where we've been exiled and into the realm of grace, right? All the while remaining attentive to the voice of nature and the voice of God. And this means taking Genesis seriously as a divinely revealed origin story that describes our origin to give us an enduring account of our identity and purpose as human beings, as woman and man.
Well, I hope you have found this discussion not only inspiring, but also informative. Christians have to be able to think, especially in this constantly changing culture, from a Christian worldview. To learn more and to find more discussions, please visit lighthousevoices.org. That's lighthousevoices.org.